All right, everyone, we start off today with a very, very important political announcement. This is something that I made an article on a month ago to the day. Links in the description. First archived, of course. This is to the story as of yesterday. The second is my Substack article. Give it a read. It's, fairly short. Some people like the sort of more edited, refined thing as opposed to the rant-style long-form video thing. Well, have at it. I'm on Substack. I'll also pin a comment down below with that instead of the normal video hosting links, of course. I make exclusive content as well every day, and we've got a big announcement, so there will be a second YouTube video today. Huzzah! It's NFT related. We're getting on the big new wave of tech thing. Luddite that I am, of course, NFTs are not that difficult to explain, so I'll do my best for the other low-info, low-tech individuals. Anyway, we now have, with the additional retirement of one Democrat in the House, the highest number of Democrats who are not seeking re-election since 1992. Now, keep in mind, in that period of time, there have been several wipeout elections. Normally, the party that's in power loses House seats. Whether they lose control or not is a different issue. Generally, when you look at retirements and presidential approval, there's a strong correlation with how many the in-party tends to lose. If the president's reasonably popular, if things are going reasonably well, you usually lose some House seats just because you're in power anyway, but it's not a big deal. Typically, you'd be looking under the current metrics at a historic landslide, probably the biggest since '92. The problem is that when you have 2-to-1 Democrats not seeking re-election, you lose the incumbent advantage in those positions. And we're nowhere near the midterms yet. To be clear, this is the most House Dems not seeking re-election since 1992, but that calculates out to the midterms themselves. Technically, it wouldn't be tied for the same amount. It'd be more if one more Dem doesn't seek re-election. The Republicans, meanwhile, again in the article I analyzed this, typically more of them have been retiring or seeking different offices, election over election. Their average is a little higher. The average for the Democrats is 14 or 15 if you look at the span of time of recent memory. We're talking since the Clinton administration, basically. 14, 15. With the Republicans, it's closer to 20, 21. Instead, you have only a handful of Republicans in that mix, less than normal, a historic high in Democrats, a historic low presidential approval for this point in the presidency. It is now slightly lower than Trump was at, which, by the way, comes with an entire multi-layer of wagon circling from the legacy media despite shitty economic news and all the other problems Biden is embroiled with. You have everything set up for the most historic overthrow of a sitting party in the United States. Again, a party that has a narrow House control anyway, can only lose a handful of seats before it loses the gavel, has no advantage in the Senate, with Kamala being a tiebreaker on anything where the filibuster doesn't apply, and a president whose approval is in the low 40s. Again, I was correct about where his soft floor is. It continues to trend at that same general line. You'll see movement up or down by a couple of points, same with his disapproval. I think he's probably hit a soft ceiling at around 55 disapproval as well. To be clear, that's a terrible place to be going into the midterms. Absolutely terrible. The Democrats know it. When I analyzed this at first and said, well, this is tied for the second most House non-re-election seeking among Democrats, so that should raise warning sirens in the Democrats' mind. They should be very, very upset about the situation. The thing is, the reason for that, it's not just random noise. It's not, hey, I just decided not to seek re-election. I want to spend time with my grandkids. I want to not seek re-election. I've decided to seek a mayorship. That does happen, but most of these people are not doing it for self-serving political reasons other than they don't want to have to fight in a midterm where they expect not to easily prevail. The worst thing for a long-term political career is not seeking re-election and doing charitable work for a couple of years. Starting a business. Those things are survivable. The worst thing is to lose. You seek re-election as an incumbent and get knocked out, it's much harder to return later. These House Dems, in some cases, do have future potential political prospects in mind. They figure it'll be easier if they just don't seek re-election. Anyway, when the Republicans knock those seats out, due in part because of the lack of incumbency, they can come back later when maybe the tide shifts, when things aren't quite so dire for them. Not a bad political strategy. Again, though, I told that this would likely happen. Of course, when I made the original Substack in mid-January, it was clear there was plenty of time for more House Dems to retire, and there were only a few House seats away from that record marker anyway. I don't know if anyone tracked it back beyond 92, but I have a feeling that if you went back through the 80s or 70s, you'd find a similar situation. This might be the most non-incumbent situation for the Democrats, as far as the number of people, at least, not seeking re-election for one reason or another, in a very, very long time. 92 is now a long time ago. I hate to say this because, of course, I was a little kid at the time, and I want to think about the 90s as the last decade, and the 70s as, like, sort of like non-ancient history. And the 80s were that cool time right before I was born in 88, so I didn't get to see most of them, sadly. This is politically looking like the early 80s. Oh boy, and Trump is salivating because, of course, Bannon and his people are stacking those non-incumbent seats and some other vulnerable Dem seats. They're trying to stack populists in there to run. What better way, if you have non-incumbency, people who in some cases dropped because they were weak candidates, they wouldn't expect to defend it. There's been a redward shift in their area. What better place to go if you want to stack the House with populists? What you could see, and this is by no means certain, but it's certainly a possibility and not a hugely unlikely one. What you could see is the development of a sort of House Republican presence that's sort of like the Geek Squad. Of course, the Geek Squad, initially the Gang of Four, but now there's 7 of these morons in the House, far-left Democrats that are trashing the party. None of them, by the way, voted for the infrastructure bill. A bunch of Republicans had to cuck in order to even get it past the House. And it was very, very funny and cringy, and at the end of the day, everyone laughed at AOC and Ilhan Omar and all these other losers. Right now, you do have some Trump sort of MAGA populists, and then like Rand and stuff in Congress, in the House and the Senate. But it's not a huge, overwhelming number. Most of that's at the state and local level. I think that you'll pick up dozens of those seats, at the very least. I think disproportionately the stronger candidates more likely to prevail are the Trump-style candidates. People who they have higher tech literacy, they're not apologizing and taking the knee all the time. They're not going to win if they represent conservative Inc. Bushism. Certainly right now one of the biggest issues is Ukraine. It doesn't need to be, but in a lot of people's minds it is. What better time to make the argument, hey, right now is probably not the time for people like Bush in office. That sounds like a bad idea because it might lead to a nuclear war. Maybe we should sit this one out. Maybe we should not warmonger. Maybe we don't actually make ourselves look better and more powerful, and it's not patriotic to suggest throwing trillions more into another needless and unwinnable war or something like that. Fighting, insurgencies in Eastern Europe. What a wonderful time, too, right on Russia's doorstep. It wouldn't cause any dust-ups, and there's no possibility of a nuclear exchange. This is absolutely dire for the Democrats. It was already bad before. A month ago, again, they were approaching this mark. It was a few seats away. It was already tied for second most retirements. And if you look back at that election, again, record landslide against the Democrats. 92, I do not recall being a good year for them, if I remember correctly. My memory doesn't span that far back. I think based on what I've read, though, not great. In fact, I think there are only 3 elections since that period where the in-party didn't lose control of the House. And I think one of them was Bush riding high right after 9/11, if I remember correctly, because everyone was like, hoorah, patriotism and shit. And I think he also managed to maintain the Senate for a while. Then losing it a couple of years later. Don't quote me on that because I'm a little bit rusty. I'm not going to go back through the last 30, 40 years of congressional matchups. I have other more interesting things to do on this particular day, although it's very fascinating. Bunch of rich old people bickering. It's exactly what I want to think about all day. But this definitely had to be talked about. This is historic. You've already got history in the making. I don't think the midterms will go well for the Democrats. And to the black pillars who are like, well, honk honk, things will be fortified. You might want to check the news because a half a dozen of the states that hadn't already imposed guidelines to ensure election fairness have done so since the last election. Well, that encompasses the vast majority of the congressional seats that are up. Of course, House seats and then a third of the senators. It encompasses most of the state houses, gubernatorial races, mayoral races, so on and so on forth, leading up to 2024 when, if you have a big enough red wave, the defortification attempts continue, you'll get more voter ID, etc., and things can be, let's say, dehonkified. Although I don't know that's the term to use right now in the wake of the truckers, who, by the way, are still holding on there. The legacy media, despite the truckers now being cleared out of some areas in Ottawa, seem to be like black-pilled about Trudeau and saying, well, it's time for him to admit the truckers basically won by forcing him to use the Emergency Powers Act. Unrelated, but still interesting. Not exactly newsworthy enough for its own video, because who wants to talk about Hobbit Justin Trudeau too much? He'll lower your testosterone level. No thanks. That's about all. Peace out.